Great. Well, this is turning into, I think, a really fascinating panel. I think the fact that standing room only suggests we're hitting on something squarely in the current zeitgeist, I think. Dirk, over to you. Dirk's going to locate some of the issues about China's role in Africa within a sort of wider overview of the BRICS in general, and particularly, I think, some of the challenges for the policy response on behalf of low-income countries. Over to you, Dirk.
Well, thank you very much, Alison, and thank you to Deborah for this excellent presentation, Dan for the excellent comments, and JICA for co-organizing this event. So what I'll do is basically putting this in a wider economic context, and first noticing that there is sort of an increased interest in the activities of China in Africa. But what I'm arguing is actually that this increased interest has increased exponentially, I think, over the last 2 years, or at least it should increase, particularly because of the sort of rapid economic growth that we've seen in the emerging markets over the last 2 years, compared to the not so rapid economic growth in other countries. Just to mention some examples, emerging markets are now topping the rich list. Emerging markets are increasing their overseas deals at a much more rapid rate than developed countries. So while the deals from emerging to developed countries have increased, the deals from developed countries in emerging markets has declined the latter half of 2009. The rapid growth that we've seen in emerging markets in China, in India, and so on, over the last few years will mean that the share of China and India together will rapidly increase in world GDP. So it was about 15% in sort of PP terms in 2007, but it's likely to be more than 20% in a couple of years. And sort of the emerging markets are playing an important role and have not suffered that much from the global financial crisis, in part because their net foreign assets was positive. And while there has been a depreciation of the currencies due to the financial crisis, that wasn't a big problem to them because they had net foreign assets in dollar terms. And of course, China is an important example. Now, how important are emerging markets for low-income countries? So we've seen this increased market share of emerging markets. What does that mean for low-income countries, and particularly their growth? Well, I think there are two types of channels that we need to look at, and Deborah has focused particularly on sort of the capital flows combined with aid and what that meant for trade. So let us think about these channels. Trade volumes and prices, that's one channel. Private capital flows and aid is a second channel. Remittances is a third channel. But there are other types of channels through which the emerging markets affect the prospects of low-income countries. And these are sort of at the global stage. I won't look at that in detail in this presentation, but just to mention that the emerging markets have an important role to play in the trade round. So there's been an important sort of differences in views between sort of India and US and China in July 2008, which sort of halted the Doha round at that stage. But if that were to happen, it would mean positive growth for sub-Saharan Africa. There are other fora where the position of emerging markets are particularly important, such as climate change. If there is a climate change deal, that can be very positive for countries that are set to be affected much by climate change, such as sub-Saharan Africa. And then there are core policies within emerging markets that have a sort of an external effect on sort of third countries, as it were. So if the exchange rate of emerging markets will change, whether they depreciate or appreciate, that will have an impact on other countries, such as sub-Saharan Africa. But let us first focus on the importance of the trade channels. And my argument is that these channels have become increasingly important, and particularly in the last few years, while sort of the links from low-income countries to developed countries has become less important. The links between low-income countries and emerging markets has become more important. And in that sense, it has become sort of a cushion against the global financial crisis for low-income countries. So we see here changes in export values or import values into Brazil, China, Korea, Turkey, and other countries, developed countries, from low-income countries. So this is the World Bank definition. And we see that that imports from low-income countries into developed countries has suffered much more from 2009, in the period 2008-2009. Now, export structures are different. So when the emerging markets become more important for low-income countries, that has also an effect on their structures, export structures. We can see here, and this gives these columns add up to 81% of the exports of low-income countries. We can see here that that low-income countries, they export oil products, of course, to both emerging markets and developed countries. But they export garments and sort of light manufacturers to developed countries, but they hardly do it to emerging markets. On the contrary, the emerging markets export much more like ores, copper, and those sort of the raw materials to emerging markets compared to the export to developed countries. Now, the share of imports or exports from low-income countries to emerging markets in sort of a G20 context has increased dramatically over the last few years. So if we take the exports from low-income countries to G20 countries and divide them into exports going to emerging markets within the G20 and exports going to the developed countries in the G20, then the share of exports going to the emerging markets within the G20 has grown from 19% to 29%. So it's growing rapidly. And that's particularly so in the last few years. Here I show data for 2007-2008. And we see that total exports, that the share of emerging markets exports in total exports from low-income countries by country has increased in 12 out of the 16 countries. Where that's only be the case for the developed countries' share in 7 out of the 16 countries. And look how important the emerging markets, export markets are for some countries. Mali, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and some very high share. Now, the second channel is on capital inflows. There are some. We've done a lot of work on the global financial crisis, and in particular on capital flows, led by Isabella Massa, who sits here. And we've been suggesting that that FDI flows to sub-Saharan Africa has fallen by about a third in 2009 compared to 2008. But there are data from the Ministry of Commerce in China that suggest, of course, there might be a problem with the data, but that suggests that Chinese FDI in Africa has actually increased by 80% in 2009 compared to 2008. True, Chinese FDI flows are still a small share, but it's rocketed. The share is increasing very rapidly, and that's due to what's happened to the financial crisis. And of course, the other inflows. We've had a detailed presentation by Deborah on the types of inflows that we've seen. But Mr. Wen announced that there will be a $10 billion amount of low-interest loans to over the coming 3 years from China to Africa. And there are a lot of other deals that are going on at the moment. The Chinese are buying up oil assets, and the other emerging markets are also increasingly engaged in deals in in African countries, in low-income countries generally. And this is a table put together by Isabella that looks at the deals in the recent years, 2009, 2010, from sort of the emerging markets or BRIC countries in low-income countries, and these deals have increased dramatically compared to a few years before, and these are worth quite a lot. So I think in 2009, sort of in Africa, these together is about 10 billion. So these are quite big numbers. So my sort of last slide is then, what does it all mean for low-income countries and their growth prospects? Well, first of all, the increased importance of the emerging markets has provided low-income countries with a lot of opportunities, and these were particularly useful during the global financial crisis. The exports to emerging markets from low-income countries didn't fall as much as exports to developed countries. So that was sort of a diversification in export destination, which helped to be a sort of a cushion against the impact of the global financial crisis. The emerging markets have also provided an enabling environment, sort of provided more development finance, so increases in foreign direct investment and so on, at a time when other flows were decreasing. So that's an important area to emphasize. It's provided many opportunities. There are also risks attached to this. I mean, first of all, I mean the opportunities together. If you had the emerging markets not grown as fast as they did, had they imported at the same rate as the developing countries, had they invested at the same rate as developed countries, Africa may have grown by less than about 1% of GDP. So if you estimated the changes in exports and FDI and so on, so it's quite a lot. But there are also risks with this. So, for instance, what I showed is that the exports going to emerging markets are of less technology content than they are to developed countries. So they are in raw materials. So there's a lack of value added in these exports, and that needs to be addressed. There's also an issue about trade balance. So, of course, exports have grown dramatically, and particularly in the last few years, the imports have also increased, and there might be some issues related to debt. So there's of course quite a few loans being put out, and that may have implications for the future. So quite a few low-income countries have received IMF loans, which need to be paid back, or well, we have to see. But within 5 years, there are other loans that are taking place at the moment that needs to be managed. So what is important is to think then about the policy implications. Is that you need to enhance the positive effects and enhance these opportunities and make sure that you mitigate the possible negatives, or the possible risks. And here we are dependent on there being good policies and institutions in low-income countries. And I think we can be rather positive about this, because the policies and institutions have much improved over the last few years, over the last decades. The responses by low-income countries to the global financial crisis, with of course a few exceptions, have been overall quite good. They have put in place macroeconomic stimulus, macroeconomic responses, monetary policy, fiscal policy, where it was possible, and they have put in place task forces to deal with the global financial crisis, and that's what our work on the financial crisis sort of brings out. So there's much to build on, but I think there are some specific areas where there's much more expertise might be needed, or where more emphasis, more capacity is needed, I suppose, which is related to managing debts, which is related to specific industrial policies, which is, for instance, the special economic zones, making sure that the special economic zones are good for development overall, and don't stay an enclave. So that is dependent on there being good industrial policies. Migration policy is also going to be important. There's going to be an extra strain on this due to migration flows. And globally, there are huge implications as well. Emerging markets can be very positive for low-income countries, and very often are. And I mentioned this 1% of GDP number just early on during the global financial crisis. But of course, it doesn't always work like that. And in international fora, low-income countries may often have similar views as emerging markets, but sometimes they don't have the same views. For instance, in trade negotiations, they don't have the same views. So I think that needs much more attention. But overall, what I'd like to conclude on is basically to say that the emerging markets have now become so important, and increasingly so during the global financial crisis for low-income countries, that we now need to think about sort of mainstreaming this and think about how and shifting the debate from what Dan mentioned about this bipolar idea of whether it's good or not, to say making sure how can emerging markets be leveraged and how can the positive effects be emphasized as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dirk.